Hello and welcome to episode 90 of Linux After Dark. I'm Joe.
I'm Chris.
I'm Gary.
And I'm May.
Welcome back all. Chris decided it would be a great idea for us to do a challenge, and that challenge is non-Linux open source OSs. Thanks for this, Chris. This was great. I had a really great time.
I don't know what you're talking about. I found it really, really easy.
Yeah, and I had a great time too. What's your problem?
God damn, this sucked.
Well, Gary, you took it upon yourself to put the 4 options into some random generator thing, and we were all assigned one. So I suppose let's get the bad out of the way first. May, what were you assigned?
I was assigned OpenIndiana, the desktop port distribution of Illumos, the open source descendant of OpenSolaris.
Right, and so I bet you had a really good time.
I didn't find the documentation handbook right away, but it turns out that the documentation is quite good. For some reason, they make a USB image that you're supposed to just DD right to a USB stick, but it only supports legacy boot.
Oh yes, I know that well.
So here I'm thinking, I got something that can do legacy boot. I have a Dell Wise 5070. Did you know that the compatibility support module is not enabled on the Wise 5070 and it only does UEFI?
I did not. I've never tried to boot a legacy in... Why would I have?
Yeah, even I haven't tried to boot Legacy for a long time, no.
But I suppose that's because it's a machine that's designed as an appliance, right? So why would you ever be deinstalling something like Illumos or whatever?
So instead I pulled out my old Asus T300G, the Transformer Book tablet thing, because lo and behold, it actually has legacy boot. And the boot disk started, but Illumos didn't have a driver for the USB subsystem. Well, obviously it did because the keyboard was working, but it couldn't find the USB drive, so I gave up on that pretty fast. And found out that the ISO image actually has EFI bootloaders in it. So I wrote that to a USB stick instead and plugged it into the Wise 5070 and went, all right, I'm so smart, this is just going to work.
I want to say at this point that you did send a screenshot to our group, and the first thing that is at the top in big letters is Hipster, which is the release name, right, for the latest release of OpenIndiana.
OpenIndiana Hipster is the rolling release model release that they have.
Right. So were you cycling on a penny farthing, drinking tasty coffees within minutes in your new operating system?
No, unfortunately, I was not in my new operating system. So I tried 5 different USB sticks. 2 of them were actually USB 2.0 only, and Illumos, the kernel would load from like the init-ramfs kind of thing they do. But once it actually came time to find the root file system and mount it, it would never work. So I don't know if it was just the USB controller on the Dell or what, but yeah, it just didn't have a driver for it apparently. And I, again, tried a whole bunch of different USB sticks, tried all the different ports, tried the USB 2.0 only ports, didn't help.
And we should say at this point that, Chris, you told us we'd get bonus points for installing it on bare metal, which I guess, May, is why you tried so hard to get it working.
It was actually May. I was just going to say, Gary, yeah, it was May who said that.
Only yourself to blame, then.
This is true. Also, when you get into the rescue shell of Illumos, whenever you do something like backspace over the front of the prompt, because it's kind of read line, but also not really. But if you do anything it doesn't like, it hits the PC speaker beeper, right?
Oh.
You know, no problem. PC speaker goes off. The Wise 5070 has the loudest fucking PC speaker I've ever heard in a computer.
That's because that speaker actually outputs audio in the OS, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not really a PC speaker.
That's a common complaint when people install pfSense or OpenSense, that every reboot it will beep really loudly.
Oh man, I unplugged that speaker so quickly when I was running mine as a pfSense box.
I hit backspace and practically jumped out of my office. So I disabled the audio controller entirely, and that made it stop. So ultimately I had to give up on that and try to use the virtual machine instead. Oh boy, getting it to run in a VM wasn't even that easy. So I started with Hyper-V because, you know, I'm on Windows. I'm a cool Windows user. I gotta use Hyper-V.
Hipster Hyper-V.
It wouldn't boot at all because Generation 2 Hyper-V VMs implement some timer that Illumos doesn't have support for yet.
Generation 2 Hyper-V VMs came out in Server 2012 R2, so over 10 years ago.
We always say wait a year or two to buy hardware for Linux, but I think we're in a new paradigm.
Wait 12 years and your hypervisor will still not be supported.
To be fair, I think Illumos itself does support it, but for some reason that kernel hasn't been released on boot images or something like that. It's very confusing. And as you can tell, I'm fairly clueless and didn't spend a ton of time on this, so if I say anything wrong, feel free to write us in, show at linuxafterdark.net.
The 3 OpenIndiana daily drivers in the world that listen to this show.
I respect you.
So in the end, you had to resort to VirtualBox.
Yes, good old Oracle VirtualBox. It's fine. It has a specific thing that you select to boot OpenIndiana, so that worked fine.
Cheers, Larry.
The default partitioning is still MBR and doesn't support EFI out of the box. And I don't know how to configure an EFI bootloader. It's using UFS2, the BSD file system. Not setting a root password in the installer creates a passwordless root account instead of no logon. And they didn't turn off screen locking during the installation, so it can totally just lock. The default password is Jack. So once I got it running and everything was working, I did a package upgrade, which took a really long time because for some reason the network performance was completely abysmal. But I don't know, maybe it just doesn't have some type of hardware acceleration that it needs. It certainly didn't for the graphics. It's Mate. It's an old version of Mate. It's an ESR version of Thunderbird and Firefox. I sent an email from Thunderbird. It was perfectly serviceable. I'd say, yeah, good operating system. Don't try to run it on bare metal unless you have the specific hardware that you need.
Well, I was assigned ReactOS. And again, thank you for that. That was great.
So for those not familiar, Joe, what is ReactOS?
ReactOS is an open source operating system that aims for binary compatibility with Windows.
Right. Fun.
Aims being the key. Now, I tried to download the ISO, stick it on my Ventoy flash drive, and it sort of would boot, but then complained about not being EFI compatible and all that. So I had to put my laptop in legacy boot. I tried this with the X270, the ThinkPad. So I put it in legacy boot, and then it sort of tried to boot, then wouldn't. I was like, right, okay, let me try DDing it. Tried to boot, then wouldn't. It's like, right, that's the end of that then. And then I remembered that many, many years ago, I tried out ReactOS and talked about it on a podcast. So I dug out my notes for that. And the only laptop that it would work on was my Dell Inspiron, whatever you say, for that 1300. And I've just found a review of that laptop from October 2006.
Nearly 20 years.
So this predates even Windows Vista, right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think it came with XP, yeah.
It's a pretty old machine.
It is. It's built like a tank, though. I love it. That's why I've still got it. 32-bit. It's got an IDE hard drive. The works.
So they still release 32-bit builds, right? Of ReactOS.
I think it's 32-bit by default.
So only 32-bit. Right, okay.
My understanding is it's only 32-bit because it was originally aiming for binary compatibility with Windows 95.
Right.
So that gives you an idea of how long the project's been going.
Yeah. So I tried to boot from USB and it just wouldn't work. Same thing. So I thought, right, I'm going to have to boot from a CD then, aren't I? But how am I going to burn a bloody CD? Thankfully, I found a spindle of CDRs, which was handy. And thankfully, what was already installed on that laptop was, I think, Ubuntu 8.04 maybe from the last time we did an ancient OS challenge. And so I burnt it onto a CD, booted into it, installed it to bare metal, and it worked, asterisk. There was no network. I don't know about USB, but there was basically no way to get new software on there.
But this is Windows, right? So you just need the drivers from Dell.com.
So I tried to get the drivers and yeah, that just didn't work. So I couldn't get Ethernet working, Wi-Fi, not a chance. So if I can't get network on it, what can I do with it? Nothing, really.
Does it have Solitaire?
I didn't look, to be honest. I've never played Solitaire. I had a brother when I was a kid. I didn't need to. We played football on the Mega Drive.
For future reference, if you're ever trying to boot old hardware again, you can use the Plop Boot Manager.
I was going to say plop as well, which makes you think of poo if you're British. But yes, it's very good.
Yeah, I did actually look for one of my Plop CDs because I burnt it like 5 times and I just couldn't find one.
You burn it to a CD and then you can chain load boot USB on devices that wouldn't boot USB natively. It's very handy on machines of that vintage.
It is very handy, yes. I've used that many times. But then I tried to get it working in a VM on the X270 and I tried with Virt Manager and I just didn't get the settings right. And I just don't know what I did wrong and I just couldn't be asked. And I thought, Martin Wimpress of Linux Matters fame wrote a very handy tool for VMs called QuickMU. I wonder if they support ReactOS. Sure enough, they do. So I installed that, got it working, and in the end had to install it about 10 times for the various tests because it just kept getting to a point where it would kind of boot up and then say press Ctrl-Alt-Delete, and then that didn't work. And then when I looked it up on the forums, it said, oh, yeah, it's corrupted, reinstall it. So thankfully, it's very quick to install. But I tried everything. My goal was, at this point, to play you a piece of music that I'd made with some old music software, but I just couldn't get it working. Just nothing would work on it. And at the end of the day, it's just old shit Windows, but open source, essentially.
So we'll come back in 30 years then.
Well, yeah. I feel bad criticizing an open source project, but from my notes last time, nearly 10 years ago, not much has changed in terms of the experience that I had with it. So I kind of get why they're doing it, but it's just ultimately not very useful. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to linuxafterdark.net/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy, 2.5 admins about system administration, Linux Matters for upbeat, family-friendly adventures, Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux, Hybrid Cloud Show for everything private and public cloud, and Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at linuxafterdark.net/support. Gary, you got the easiest one, I reckon, GhostBSD.
So I had an overall okay experience that reminded me of Linux about 17, 18 years ago when I first started using it. I initially thought I was traveling at the time that I would try this in a VM. So fired up my Proxmox host, downloaded the ISO, and went to install it and realized, oh, there is no keyboard and mouse here. And went digging online, and it turns out that the BSD kernel included with GhostBSD doesn't support virtualized keyboard and mouse in KVM, and that this is a known issue. And the suggested solution was that I plug in a USB keyboard and mouse and pass them through to the VM, and then complete the installation that way whilst looking at the VNC window. Slight issue is that my Proxmox server is in a different country, so that's not really going to fly. So had to go back to the drawing board and write it off, come back a few days later when I was at home and try and install on physical hardware. I tried my N100 machine, couldn't get it to boot on there for whatever reason, so thought, what machine have I got that I've successfully run BSD on before? Of course, the Wise 5070.
Yeah!
I have 2 different Wise 5070s, and annoyingly pulled the lower spec Celeron Wise 5070 out of the drawer, which will become slightly important later when I get on to installing software. So the initial install went absolutely fine. The only hardware that I couldn't get to work was the USB-C touchscreen monitor that I use for these experiments. Basically just USB-C with DisplayPort alt mode and then emulates a USB tablet. Generally works fine under Linux. Didn't even get recognized as a mouse under GhostBSD. Ethernet was also a little bit weird. It would only negotiate a network connection if the network cable was plugged in at boot time on the machine, which was a little bit annoying because I'd forgotten to do that initially. And then I thought, I can just connect to Wi-Fi. I've got a USB Wi-Fi adapter. No, that also didn't work. Looked up some instructions there, and it seemed that the suggested solution was to install Beehive, create a Linux VM, pass the USB Wi-Fi adapter through, and then use IP tables to NAT the traffic through the Linux VM, which is clearly not going to happen.
You can tell that this is based on FreeBSD because it just assumes that you are a network admin, essentially.
Yeah, but the Realtek controller in the Wise 5070 did work, provided that it was connected before I pressed the power button. Don't know why that was, but there we go. I've got 2 Realtek network controllers in that Wise 5070. Both exhibited the same behavior. And broadly, once I got up and running, it was just like running an outdated Mate desktop. Everything worked absolutely fine. I could browse the web in Firefox. I could install the various things from the FreeBSD package repositories, things like LibreOffice, all the open source software that we'd want. And then I thought, I'm going to see if I could record some audio on here. I had various audio things that I needed to do and wanted to install Audacity. Turns out that that's only available in ports in FreeBSD.
That involves compiling then. That's your foreshadowing earlier.
Yes, and this is where the downfall came. So I set up ports on the machine and CD'd to user local ports audio Audacity and proceeded to do sudo make install clean. And I let the machine sit for 8 hours. Because obviously it's not just compiling Audacity, right? It's every single dependency sits in the tree for Audacity. All of the docs, everything else. It sat there for 8 hours. And all right, it probably wasn't 8 hours of solidly compiling because I was getting bored and walking off. And then I'd come back and there'd be a prompt which I had to press enter on. But the machine sat there for 8 hours. And in the end, the compile errored out with some cryptic error that I couldn't understand. And I gave up and turned it off.
Aww.
Now, this is why I said that I probably should have pulled the slightly more powerful Pentium-powered Wise 5070 off the stack, because maybe the compile would have failed in 6 hours then. Who knows?
There's not that much between them, I have to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think there is a huge amount. But I was able to write some code in VS Code. I was able to watch some YouTube videos in Firefox. I was able to install Chromium and access my virtual desktop for work. So all of the usual stuff that I'd want to get done in a browser was broadly okay, but there were quite a lot of rough edges.
So, Chris, you got Haiku, which I generally hear quite good things about.
Yeah, has anyone else ever tried to run it before?
I have a pressed Haiku CD.
From when?
FOSDEM 19, maybe 20.
Right. Okay. So that's good. We'll come back to that. So yeah, it's called Haiku, but the website SEOs to Haiku OS because Googling Haiku gets you loads and loads of stuff about haikus. So it's not a fork of BIOS, but it's reverse engineered largely, which is quite interesting. So BIOS and B machines, there was a B box. They were like sort of hailed as the new Amiga and PowerPC, but they never took off. Apparently because Microsoft realized they might have a chance and just sent the suits in. They were like, right, shut this down, stop the vendors forming partnerships, give them cheap Windows. So it never took off. So by the end of its life, it was owned by Palm and they wouldn't license the proprietary source code out. So enthusiasts reverse engineered everything except Tracker, which is the main part of the GUI. So sort of the desktop environment, and Deskbar, which is the taskbar, but it lives the top right. So it doesn't go all the way across. It's the top right corner is a button with an applications menu, a bit like XFCE's application menu, not the Whisker menu. So it's just text-driven nested menus. It's quite an interesting OS that has quite a following. It did used to have an annual conference, apparently, called Begeistert, which is German. I used the same machine I always use for this, a second-gen Latitude with 8 gigs of RAM and an SSD, just a SATA SSD. And at first, I didn't bother using Ventoy because I already read up that's not going to work. So I DD'd a USB and it wouldn't boot. And I was like, oh no, this is annoying. And then I realized I'd left an SD card in from the janky NAS challenge. And this used to be a problem on old Linux. If you had a USB connected device, when you booted, it would sometimes hang trying to work out if it was bootable. So I just popped that out and it booted so quickly. Almost quicker than Alpine does. It's one of the fastest booting operating systems I've ever seen. And that was the same once I'd installed it. It's also BIOS by default legacy, but they have an advanced wiki for EFI. So I did that. So I was basically just mounting the live ISO, copying the EFI files, formatting a partition for BFS, which is the BIOS file system, which is confusing because in Linux, BFS means the boot file system. So they call it BEFS. So yeah, I got it copied over. It's a bit like if you've ever installed MX Linux. It's very, very quick. It just dumps what it needs into a root partition. There's still 32-bit and 64-bit builds because 32-bit is more popular, a bit like with you, Joe, with ReactOS. A lot of people that run it want to run binary compatible applications that were originally for BIOS. So running at 32-bit allows you to do that, whereas running at 64-bit means you get more compatibility with ported software, but you lose that original sheen. So yeah, the reason I mentioned when did you try it, in 2018 there was a massive release that improved hardware support. So as far as I'm aware, they get their Wi-Fi stack from BSD, but I got 200/200 over Wi-Fi connected to my main Wi-Fi network with a Intel 7260 card that was in there. It doesn't automatically connect on boot, so you have to manually boot, but it does cache the credentials. Sound worked, the webcam wasn't detected, the touchpad worked, but it didn't have like gestures or two-finger tapping.
Oh, you're going back to a computer from the 90s.
Well, luckily this has physical buttons for that, but yeah, I couldn't work it out. I did try Bluetooth and there was a kernel panic. I connected my phone and the whole thing just fell apart. But yeah, I mean, broadly, there's a weird GUI application called Devices, which looks exactly like Device Manager. And there was loads of stuff listed as unknown device, like on a bad Windows install, but it worked. And if Joe can put it in the show notes, there's a blog which goes into this a lot more. The package management is really interesting because it's very like Nixos. This guy called Mark Round has written a blog which goes into it in more detail. But basically, root is immutable. And when you want to install something, you dump a package file and then it mounts it in an overlay FS. And when you make those changes, it creates a saved state that you can roll back to. So there's like a remarkable immutable crossover here. It's single user, so you can just do things. There's no sudo do things. You just do things, which is not really very good. And there is Haiku ports, which is, like you said, Gary, with ports, it's a similar thing. It's a bit like an AUR helper. You pull down the source code and compile from source, and loads of stuff from Linux being ported. Because obviously I tried web browsers. The one that comes with is Web Positive, which sounds like something you get free on a CD with Computer Shopper. And nothing works on the internet. YouTube doesn't work. But I installed Falcon, Iceweasel, and NetSurf from ports. And Falcon played YouTube without hardware acceleration to about 720p. So all in all, it reminded me a bit of Morphos. If you remember the nested virtualization challenge, that's like an Amiga-like OS that's modern.
Yes, this is what I was trying to think of. That was really popular with old PowerPC Macs and stuff, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I see the use case of this. If I still had a 32-bit netbook, as main Linux distros are dropping support, I could see running this on it quite nicely. Now, the difficulty is, as I say, if you pick 32-bit, you don't get as many ports because it's harder to compile. But it's really snappy and fast. And depending on what your use case, you can install ported retro emulators and stuff. It would make the machine fairly usable. And it is really well put together and has a very dedicated following.
Don't do it. Don't make me get the EPC out of the drawer again.
Yeah, I'm thinking about my EPC as well.
Haiku is a lot of fun. I would recommend it.
The one thing I would say that's really interesting, though, is when I was reading up about the package management, because there's a CLI tool and a graphical tool. And as I say, this blog post, if you're really interested, goes in how it works and ports and how to set it up. And it was really helpful. But it was really controversial when they added a package manager. And lots of people were like, this isn't Linux and we don't want it to be Linux. Why have you done this? We like it exactly how it is and everything should just be how Haiku is. And I found that really interesting. There are Hacker News threads that go on for ages where the maintainers are defending the choice to have dependency resolution and things like that. Very odd. So in summary then, I had a good time. Gary had a good time. And May and Joe did not have a good time.
I had a bad time, I'm afraid.
I had a bad time.
Well, I could actually see GhostBSD having some use on a machine in my house. So there we go.
Well, we'd better wrap it up then. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. But until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Chris.
I've been Gary.
And I've been May.
See you later.